In the grand ballrooms of Regency London, the moonlit gardens of France, the sun-kissed villas of Italy, and the passionate streets of Spain, love has always found a way. Here, we bring you original historical romance stories, filled with passion, sacrifice, and unforgettable destinies. Before tonight's tale begins, don't forget to subscribe and join our growing community of romantics from around the world. And tell us in the comments, where are you watching from tonight? Now, settle in and let history whisper its most beautiful secrets. This is Tales of Whispering Hearts. There is a particular kind of pain that does not announce itself. It does not arrive with the theatrical force of a storm or the clean, decisive cut of something sharp. It arrives instead as a small wrongness, a detail that does not fit, a silence where there should be sound, a hand that rests too familiarly on a sleeve in a crowded room, and in the space between seeing it and understanding it, the whole architecture of a life rearranges itself into something unrecognizable, and nothing that comes after is ever quite the same shape as what came before. Rosalind Hale, the Countess of Merivale, understood this in the space of perhaps 4 seconds on the night of the Hartfield Grand Ball, in the 3rd week of November, 1817. 4 seconds in the east corridor of Hartfield House, between one step and the next, in which she saw her husband's hand at the waist of a woman in blue silk, and his face turned toward that woman's face, with an expression she had never once, in 4 years of marriage, seen him turn toward hers. 4 seconds, and then she walked back the way she had come, through the ballroom, through the entrance hall, out into the cold November night, and into the waiting carriage, and told the driver to take her home. She did not cry in the carriage. She was not, in those first minutes, capable of crying. She was capable only of looking at the streetlights passing on the other side of the glass, and understanding, with the flat, terrible clarity that arrives sometimes before the feeling does, that everything she thought she knew had been, for some time, something other than what she had believed it to be. This is her story. Not the 4 seconds in the corridor. Those are only the beginning. This is the story of what came after, and what it cost, and what it built, and the woman who stood in the ruins of one life and found, slowly and painfully, and with considerable courage, that she was capable of building another. Rosalind had married Edward Hale, the Earl of Merivale, at 22, which was the appropriate age for an appropriate marriage in the England of 1813. She had been the eldest daughter of Sir George Fairfax of Surrey, a respectable family, comfortably situated, without the grand title or the great fortune that would have made her a first-rate catch in the marriage market's most brutal calculations, but with enough of both to make her a perfectly acceptable second-rate one. Edward had been 30, handsome in the organized, definitive way of men who have been told they are handsome often enough that it has become part of how they hold themselves. He was charming in company, quick with wit, generous with attention, the kind of man who made a room feel as though it had improved upon his arrival. He had seemed, when he courted her, genuinely interested in her opinions about things, in the small particular details of who she was, and she had mistaken this for the sustained interest of a man who intended to keep paying attention, rather than the temporary performance of a man who wanted to be found appealing and was very good at it. She had not been naive. She had been, she would understand later, simply inexperienced in the difference between a man who is interested in you and a man who is interested in being liked by you, which are two things that look identical from the outside and feel entirely different once you are living inside one of them. The first year of the marriage had been acceptable, not passionate. She had not expected passionate, had not been raised to expect it, had understood that companionable and respected were the realistic goals, and had aimed for those. Edward was considerate in the ways that were visible to others, and gradually less considerate in the ways that were not, which was a pattern she had noticed, and attributed, for too long, to the natural settling of a new arrangement, rather than the revelation of an existing character. The second year she had 2 miscarriages, 4 months apart, and Edward had been sympathetic in the correct, slightly uncomfortable manner of a man who considers grief a private business and is vaguely unnerved by its public expression. She had learned, in those months, not to cry where he could see her, which was not a rule he stated, but one that his responses had communicated with sufficient consistency that she had understood and adjusted accordingly. By the 3rd year, she had understood that she was not going to be known by her husband, not in the deep way, not the way she had believed, at 22, that a marriage was supposed to mean. She had adjusted her expectations downward with the pragmatic courage of a woman who prefers the truth to a comfortable delusion, and had constructed, within the marriage's limits, a life that was her own. Her friendships, her reading, her involvement in the management of the Merivale estate in Suffolk, which Edward found uninteresting and she found genuinely absorbing. She had thought she was managing. She had thought that what she had was not what she had wanted, but was livable, and that livable was not nothing, and that she had built enough of herself around the edges of the marriage to be, in some essential way, whole. She had not known about the lying. She had not known about the woman in blue silk. Now she did. The woman's name was Mrs. Lucinda Vane. Rosalind learned this the following morning, through the efficient and merciless machinery of London gossip, which reached her before Edward came down to breakfast, via a note from her dearest friend, Charlotte Pemberton, who had been at the Hartfield ball, and had seen what Rosalind had seen, and had come home and written immediately with the careful, loving urgency of someone who wants a friend to hear bad news first from someone who loves her. Charlotte's note said, "My dearest R, I must write before you hear it elsewhere. Mrs. Vane was at the ball. I saw them together. I believe others did as well. I am coming to you this morning. Please wait for me." Rosalind sat with the note at her breakfast table and thought about the name, which she recognized. She recognized it because Edward had mentioned it 6 months ago at a dinner, in passing. The way you mention something you have already decided is not worth mentioning. He had said that a Vane family had taken a house in Grosvenor Square, that he had known Geoffrey Vane slightly at Oxford, that Mrs. Vane was a pleasant enough woman. He had said it with the particular off-handedness of a man describing something of no significance, and she had listened with the particular half-attention of a wife who has learned that her husband's social observations rarely contain anything that requires her full focus, and she had filed the name away in the unimportant category and thought nothing more of it. The note, the deliberate casualness. She sat at the breakfast table and reconstructed it, and the reconstruction cost her something she could feel physically, a tightening in her chest that was not quite grief and not quite anger, but contained both, and under them something older and colder that was the particular hurt of having been not just betrayed, but managed. He had managed her. He had calculated what she would and would not notice, and he had been right. And the being right was in some ways worse than the betrayal itself, because it meant he had looked at her clearly enough to understand exactly how little attention was required to deceive her. She was still sitting with this when Edward came downstairs. He came into the breakfast room with the easy, unhurried bearing of a man who is either certain he has not been seen or has decided that certainty is the best posture regardless. He sat down. He poured his coffee. He said good morning, with the precise intonation of every other good morning for 4 years, and Rosalind sat across the table from him and looked at his face, the handsome, organized, charming face, and felt something inside her that had been soft, become, quietly and permanently, something harder. She said, "Mrs. Vane was at the Hartfield ball last night." The pause was very small. A man less practiced would have produced a larger one. "Was she?" he said, in the tone of mild, incurious acknowledgement. "I did not see her." Rosalind looked at him across the table, at the coffee cup, at the hand that held it, at the face that was now performing a version of indifference that she recognized as performance, because she had become, without intending to, an expert in the difference between what Edward felt and what Edward showed. "I saw you," she said, very quietly, very level. The cup was set down. A longer pause this time. "Rosalind." "I am not going to cry," she said, still in the same quiet, level voice. "I want you to know that first, so that we can conduct this conversation properly. I am not going to cry, and I am not going to shout, and I am not going to give you any version of this that allows you to manage me through it, which I am now aware is something you are very good at." He looked at her with an expression she had not seen from him before. Not guilt, not exactly, but the expression of a man who has been handling something carelessly for a long time and has just understood that the thing is no longer in his hands. "It is not," he began. "Please," she said, "do not tell me what it is not. Tell me what it is and how long it has been, and then we will know where we actually are." The silence was long enough that the fire in the grate had time to shift and settle. 8 months, he said. She had suspected 6. 8 was worse. She absorbed this with the controlled stillness of a woman who has already used up the shock and is now operating on something more durable. And the introduction at the dinner, she said. The Oxford friend's wife, the pleasant enough woman. Yes, he said. His voice had the flatness of a man who has been caught in something that cannot be made smaller by handling. You made me believe she was unimportant, Rosalind said. That was deliberate. He said nothing, which was answer enough. Did you think I would not notice, she said, or did you think it did not matter whether I noticed? He looked at her, and in his eyes she saw, beneath the composure, something she had not expected to see. Not contempt, not the coldness of someone who has fundamentally disregarded her, but something more complicated, something that looked, at its edges, like the discomfort of a man who has regarded someone and found the regarding, now that it was returned clearly, uncomfortable to sustain. I thought, he said slowly, that it could be managed. Yes, she said, I know. She stood up from the breakfast table, which was not the dramatically satisfying gesture it might sound, because her knees were uncertain beneath her, and she had to hold the table's edge for a moment before they steadied, which she did not permit him to see. She looked at him from standing, which gave her something she needed, which was the angle of choice. I am going to stay with Charlotte, she said, while I determine what I want to do. Rosalind, his voice changed. The managed composure gave way, briefly, to something more urgent. This does not have to become a public matter, if you will allow me to. To manage it, she said. He stopped. I will send for my things, she said. Please tell the servants I am visiting a friend. She left the room and the house and took the carriage to Charlotte Pemberton's townhouse on Brook Street and sat in Charlotte's small upstairs sitting room with a cup of tea she did not drink and her dearest friend beside her. And then, finally, after the breakfast room and the carriage and the whole long-managed morning, she cried. Charlotte Pemberton was the best kind of friend to have in the worst kind of circumstances, not because she said the right things, but because she understood, with the particular intelligence of a woman who paid close attention to the people she loved, when not to say things at all. She sat beside Rosalind and held her hand, and let the crying run its course without attempting to interrupt it with comfort, which was the most useful thing she could have done. When it was over, Rosalind sat in the upstairs sitting room, with her eyes swollen and her hands very still in her lap, and said, with the flatness of someone who has moved through the worst of a first wave, 8 months. I know, Charlotte said. He introduced her at dinner. He told me about her first. He chose that. Chose to put her name in front of me, as something small and unimportant, so that if I ever heard the name again, it would already have the flavor of something I knew and had assessed and found unremarkable. She paused. That is not carelessness. That is not a man who forgot he had a wife. That is a man who planned. Charlotte was quiet for a moment. Yes, she said, I know. What I cannot decide, Rosalind said, is whether knowing that makes it better or worse. How could it make it better? Charlotte asked carefully. Because it means he was thinking about me, Rosalind said, and heard how that sounded, and closed her eyes briefly. Which is the most terrible thing I have ever said. It is not terrible, Charlotte said. It is honest. There is a difference. She moved slightly, turning to face Rosalind more directly. What do you want to do? Rosalind was quiet for a long time. Outside Charlotte's window, London went about its business, indifferent, constant, unconcerned with the rearrangement of one woman's understanding of her own life. I want, she said carefully, to stop feeling like I have done something wrong, which I know I have not done, but which is, at present, how I feel, because 4 years of being managed leaves a residue, and the residue is the suspicion that if I had been more watchful, more interesting, more demanding of his attention, that this might not have happened. Which I know, in the part of me that is still thinking clearly, is untrue, but the feeling is there, and I wanted to say it aloud to you, rather than carry it quietly. Charlotte reached out and took both her hands. You have not done anything wrong, she said. Not one single thing. I know, Rosalind said. Tell me again in a week, when I am less certain. Charlotte said she would, and she meant it, which is what mattered. The week at Charlotte's house was the first week in 4 years that belonged entirely to Rosalind, not in the freedom of it, which was not freedom at all, but the disorientation of someone whose entire structure has been removed and who does not yet know where to stand, but in the thinking of it. She had 4 years to reconsider, and she reconsidered them with the methodical, uncomfortable thoroughness of a woman who values truth over comfort, and had been, without fully knowing it, deprived of the truth version of her own life for 4 years. She was not an unintelligent woman. She had not been asleep in her marriage. She had noticed things, the smallnesses, the management, the calibrated versions of himself that Edward had offered, rather than the actual one. She had noticed, and she had filed them away under the category of acceptable disappointments, which was the category that polite society invented for the gap between what marriage was supposed to be and what it actually was, and she had not permitted herself to examine them too closely, because examining them would have required her to do something about them, and doing something about them had seemed, at the time, more frightening than accommodating them. She examined them now. She examined them with the flat and unflinching attention of a woman who has nothing left to protect by not looking. She found, at the end of the examination, that she was angry, not the hot, immediate anger of the corridor and the breakfast room, something slower and more sustained than that, the anger of a woman who has understood the full extent of what was taken from her. Not just the faithfulness, not just the last 8 months, but the 4 years of calibration, of managed versions, of a husband who had decided from the beginning what she was allowed to know about her own marriage and had administered her life accordingly. She had been treated, she understood, as something to be managed. Not because he was a monster. He was not a monster. He was a man who had learned, in the way that certain men learn, that women could be handled, that attention and charm were currencies that could be strategically deployed, that a wife who believed herself known was a wife who would not look too closely. He had done it without cruelty and without particular deliberateness, in the way that people do the things they have always done, because no one has yet made them stop. She had been the first to make him stop. She sat with this for a long time. She sat with the anger and the grief and the specific, particular loss of the version of her marriage she had believed existed, which had never existed, which was perhaps the most significant loss of all, not the real thing taken, but the false thing revealed. The discovery that the comfort she had thought she was living in was a costume over nothing. And then, on the 7th morning at Charlotte's house, she sat at the writing desk in the guest room and wrote a letter to her father. Sir George Fairfax came to London on a Tuesday, and he was the kind of father who arrived for his daughter without asking unnecessary questions first, and held her for a long moment in Charlotte's entrance hall before either of them said anything, which told Rosalind everything she needed to know about whether she had been right to write to him. He was 61, her father, with the solid and weathered look of a man who had spent his life on a Surrey estate and was more comfortable outdoors than in, and he sat in Charlotte's sitting room with his large hands on his knees and listened to everything Rosalind told him, all of it, including the parts she thought might be difficult to tell her father, without interrupting, with the quiet, total attention that she recognized as the best thing she had inherited from him. When she finished, he said, "What do you want, Rosie?" She had not been called Rosie since she was 12. It unmade her, slightly, which she had not expected. "I want to understand what is possible," she said, when she had steadied. "Legally, practically. I have the Merivale estate income while I am married to him, but I know that that a separation you would have your own income," her father said. "Not Merivale. Your grandfather's settlement, which was tied to you specifically, and not to the marriage. It is not what you have now, but it is enough. I know what it is because I made certain of it when you married, which is something I did not tell you at the time because I hoped you would never need to know it." She looked at her father, at the solid, weathered face of a man who had loved her with the particular steady love of someone who does not say much but thinks ahead. "You hoped I would never need it," she said. "Yes," he said. "I also wanted you to have it if you did." She pressed her lips together very tightly for a moment. Then she said, "I want to separate. Formally. I know what it will cost in society's eyes. I know what they will say. I have been thinking about what they will say for a week, and I have arrived at the conclusion that what they say is less important than what is true, and what is true is that I cannot continue to live in a house with a man who has spent 4 years deciding what I am allowed to know about my own life." Her father nodded once. "Then we will manage it," he said. "Your brother knows a lawyer in Gray's Inn who handles these matters. There will be talk. It will be the worst kind of talk for a few months. And then something else will happen, and they will talk about that instead." "I know," she said. "You are not what they will say you are," he said. "I know that too," she said. "But thank you for saying it." The separation, when it was formalized, took the shape that such things always took in the England of 1817, quiet on the surface, extremely loud underneath, for the weeks that the social world required to process it and move on. Edward did not contest it, which surprised no one who had seen his face in the breakfast room that morning. He was not, in the end, a man who would make something messy when a clean withdrawal was available. The terms were handled through lawyers. The Merivale house in London was his. Rosalind kept a portion of the estate income by agreement and moved, with her father's income, into a small but decent townhouse in Bloomsbury, which was not quite the address of her marriage, but was respectable and quiet, and, crucially, entirely her own. Charlotte Pemberton was magnificent throughout all of it, in the way that Charlotte was magnificent at the things that mattered, openly, unashamedly partisan, present at every public occasion where Rosalind appeared, standing beside her with the quiet declaration of a woman telling the whole room where her loyalty lived. Other women fell away, some permanently, some temporarily, the ones who were frightened of the proximity of scandal, the ones whose husbands had preferred to distance themselves from the situation, the ones who had never liked Rosalind much and now had a socially acceptable reason to express it. Rosalind watched them go with a clarity that surprised her. It turned out that the reduction of her social circle was, once the initial sting faded, something closer to a relief. What remained, after the reduction, was smaller and better. Charlotte, her father, her younger sister Margaret, who arrived from Surrey with a basket of things from the garden and a face full of the kind of indignant love that younger sisters produce better than anyone. An older woman she had known slightly for years, Lady Agatha Prentice, who had been through something similar a decade earlier, and arrived on Rosalind's doorstep one afternoon with a bottle of wine and the flat, been-through-it composure of someone who knows which parts of the experience will pass and which parts will change everything, and which is which. Lady Agatha was 63 and had the bearing of a woman who had long since stopped requiring anyone's approval and found the liberation of this so thoroughgoing that she had become, in her 60s, more fully herself than she had ever been in her 20s. She sat in Rosalind's Bloomsbury sitting room on that first visit and said, with the directness of someone who has nothing to perform, "The first 6 months are the worst, not because of what you have lost, though you have lost something real, but because you are learning who you are outside the structure of it, and that is always harder than it sounds." Rosalind looked at her. "Did you know," she said, before it was over, "did you know you would be all right?" "No," Lady Agatha said, without hesitation. "I did not know that. I only knew that the alternative, staying, continuing, living inside the managed version of things, felt more frightening than the unknown. And I was right about that, though it took 3 years to feel like I was right." Rosalind thought about the managed version of things, about the coffee cup set down, about 8 months and a name introduced casually at dinner. 3 years, she said. "Less for you," Lady Agatha said. "You are younger than I was, and you already know how to tell the truth, which is the thing that takes most women the longest to learn. It took me until I was 45 to say what I actually meant in a room. You already do it. The rest is just time." Time passed, as it always does, with the particular combination of slowness and inexorability that makes grief and recovery so difficult to bear. Slow enough that you feel you will never be different than you are now. Fast enough that when you look back you cannot identify the exact moment you became different. Rosalind built the Bloomsbury life with the methodical care of someone who understands they are building from the ground. She made the house her own, not lavish, but thoughtful, with books on every surface and a small garden at the back that she attended herself in the spring, because being in soil did something for her grief that she could not have articulated but could feel. She engaged herself in a charity school for girls in the parish, which Charlotte had introduced her to, and which turned out to require the organizational capability she had always had and had never been fully allowed to use. She renewed old friendships and made new ones, the kind that could only be made by a person who had decided to stop managing their presentation and simply be met as they were. She did not, in the first year, think about love. She thought about herself, about the woman who had been married at 22 and managed for 4 years, and had arrived in Bloomsbury at 26, knowing how to accommodate and how to adjust and how to file things in the acceptable disappointments category, and who was now, slowly and with considerable effort, learning other things. Learning what she actually thought about the world when she was not arranging her thinking for the comfort of someone who did not want to be challenged. Learning what made her laugh, what made her angry, what she cared about when caring, did not need to be calibrated against someone else's preferences. Learning, most essentially, what it felt like to take up her own space without apology. Lady Agatha called on her regularly, and these calls became, over the months, the most useful education Rosalind received, because Lady Agatha had lived on the other side of everything Rosalind was going through, and had emerged from it, not diminished but enlarged, and her presence was a kind of evidence that the enlargement was possible. Charlotte was her constancy, present, warm, occasionally frustrated on her behalf, in the way that only close friends can be frustrated, never pushing but always available, the fixed point, in a landscape that was otherwise still uncertain. Her father came from Surrey once a month, and they walked on the heath if the weather permitted, and talked about the estate, and her work at the charity school, and the books she was reading, and sometimes, in the quieter moments at the end of these walks, about the things she had not yet figured out. Her father never told her what to do with the things she had not figured out. He listened, and then said something simple and true, and let her do the figuring herself, which was, she understood, how he had always loved her, not by managing her, but by trusting her to manage herself. By the spring of 1819, 18 months after the ball, 18 months after the 4 seconds in the East Corridor, she understood that she was different, not recovered, which implied a return to what she had been, and she had no wish to return to what she had been. Different, rebuilt from different materials, with different priorities, along different lines. Someone who knew what she was and what she was not, who had looked clearly at the worst of things and was still standing, who had stopped being managed by anyone, including herself. She was 28 years old, and she was, for the first time in her adult life, entirely her own. The question of the future, of what it was to be, now that she had rebuilt the present, was one she did not address directly for some time, because she had learned, in the Bloomsbury years, that addressing things before they were ready produced worse results than allowing them to arrive in their own order. But it arrived eventually, as things do, not through deliberate consideration, but through the side door of an ordinary situation. The ordinary situation was a lecture on antiquities at the Royal Institution, which she attended with Charlotte in the autumn of 1819, on the grounds that the speaker was supposed to be interesting, and neither of them had anything more pressing. The speaker was indeed interesting, a brisk and passionate man from Edinburgh who had spent 3 years in Greece and had opinions about the Elgin marbles that were considerably more complex than the current social consensus on the subject, and who delivered them with a conviction that Rosalind found refreshing in a lecture hall that usually contained considerably more decorum than substance. Afterward, in the informal gathering that followed such lectures, Charlotte was drawn into conversation with an old friend, and Rosalind found herself standing near the refreshments in that particular position of solitary independence that she had learned to inhabit without discomfort, not waiting to be addressed, not performing an occupation, simply present, which was something she had become good at. A man stopped beside her to reach the table and said, "I thought the section on Theseus and the frieze problems was the best part." She looked at him. He was perhaps 31 or 32, with an open, non-managed sort of face, the kind of face that had not learned to be cautious, or had learned and decided against it, and brown eyes that were looking at her with the simple and direct interest of someone who is beginning a conversation because they want to have it, not because protocol requires it. "I thought it was the most contentious part," she said, "which is probably why it was the best part." He smiled, quickly, genuinely, with nothing calculated about it. "Were you on his side or the consensus?" "His side," she said. "The consensus has had its argument made more times than the argument requires. It is beginning to mistake repetition for proof." He looked at her with an expression of mild and genuine delight. "That is the most precise summary of the debate I have heard." "I have had practice," she said, "at distinguishing repetition from proof." She said it with a lightness that was entirely real, the lightness of someone who has come through something difficult enough that the truth of it can now be said without weight. He registered the lightness and, she noticed, also registered what was underneath it. Not with intrusion, not with the probing curiosity of someone who wants to excavate, but with the simple acknowledgement of a person who had heard something with more in it than the surface and had decided that the depth was worth respecting. "James Hartwell," he said. "I am sorry, I have been entirely informal. James Hartwell, a friend of Professor Mackenzie's who organized the lecture. I am here on sufferance mostly." Rosalind Fairfax, she said, which was her father's name, the name she had returned to, and which was simpler and truer, and hers in a way the other had never entirely been. They talked for 20 minutes, about the lecture and about Greece and about a book on antiquity they had both recently read and reached different conclusions from, which required a second 20 minutes to partially reconcile. Charlotte found her at the end of it with the expression of a woman who has been watching something from across the room and has formed conclusions. In the carriage, Charlotte said nothing, which was, Rosalind had learned, Charlotte's most eloquent register. "He was interesting," Rosalind said, answering the silence. "Yes," Charlotte said, "he was." "That is all," Rosalind said. "Of course," Charlotte said, in the tone that meant she believed something entirely different and had the patience to wait. Rosalind looked out the carriage window at the autumn city. She thought about the conversation, about the way he had listened, and the way his face had received the things she said, and the particular thing she had noticed that she had not noticed in a long time because she had stopped looking for it, the quality of attention. Whether the person across from her was actually there. He had been actually there, she thought. That is interesting, she thought. I am not in any hurry, she thought. I have rebuilt myself from the ground up, and I am not going to hand the building to anyone who does not deserve it, and I do not yet know who deserves it, and I am patient enough now to find out. She was, for the first time, patient enough to find out. James Hartwell was not a man with a grand title or a great estate, which suited Rosalind precisely, because she had had the grand title and the great estate, and knew exactly what they could and could not provide. He was the second son of a Shropshire baronet, with a modest income from his father's settlement, a position as a fellow at a learned society whose work he found genuinely absorbing, and a life organized entirely around the things he actually cared about, which were antiquities, honest conversation, and the particular pleasure of spending time with people who said what they thought. He called on her 3 weeks after the lecture, having obtained her direction through Professor Mackenzie, who had obtained it from Charlotte in a sequence of social events that Rosalind suspected her friend had engineered with more deliberateness than she admitted. She received him in the Bloomsbury sitting room, with its books on every surface and the November garden visible through the window, and he came in and looked at the books before he sat down, which told her something, and then sat down and began talking as though they had not had 6 weeks since the lecture, but were simply continuing. She liked this. She liked being talked to as though the last conversation had been this morning rather than weeks ago, as though she was someone whose company was continuous rather than occasional, someone to be resumed rather than restarted. She also noticed over the weeks that followed, for he called regularly and she received him regularly, and the calling and receiving developed the comfortable rhythm of something that both parties intend to continue, that he did not manage her. He did not calibrate what he said to what he thought she wanted to hear. He did not handle her opinions as things to be redirected, or minimized or agreed with for the sake of smoothness. He said what he thought, which was sometimes different from what she thought, and when it was different, he was interested in the difference rather than threatened by it. She tested this, not cruelly but honestly, said things she believed that she knew were not what he believed, and watched what happened. What happened was that he asked questions. What had led her to that position? Had she read the argument in such and such a paper that offered a different angle? What did she make of this particular piece of evidence? He engaged with her as though her thinking was something to be understood rather than managed, and the novelty of this was so thoroughgoing and so affecting that she had to be careful, in the first months, not to confuse the relief of it with the thing itself. She was careful. She was patient in a way she had not been capable of at 22, because at 22, she had not yet understood what impatience cost. She let it proceed at the pace it proceeded at, and she watched, and she thought, and she spoke to Charlotte, and to Lady Agatha, and to her father, and she brought to it the full capacity she had developed over 2 years of learning to trust her own assessment of things. Her assessment was, this is a person who will actually look at you. Her assessment was, this is different, in the ways that actually matter, from what you had before. Her assessment was, you are not the woman you were at 22, and this time, you are choosing with your eyes open. He told her, one evening in the winter of 1820, in her sitting room, with the fire low and the city quiet outside, that he was in love with her, in the matter-of-fact, somewhat startled way of a man reporting a truth he has been arriving at gradually, and has now arrived at completely. She looked at him for a long moment. She thought about the 4 seconds in the East Corridor at the Hartfield ball, and the breakfast room, and the week at Charlotte's, and the Bloomsbury house, and the garden in spring, and the charity school, and Lady Agatha's 3 years, and her father's steady hands. She thought about the woman she had been, and the woman she had built, and about what it meant to offer the built woman to someone who had known nothing but the built version, who had no managed version to compare her to, who had simply met her as she was, and found her, exactly as she was, worth knowing. She said, "I am in love with you too. I want you to know that I say it carefully, not because I doubt it, but because I have learned what it costs to say it, without knowing what you are saying it to, and I know now. I am saying it to you, exactly as you are, because you are the first person in my adult life who has ever let me be exactly as I am." He looked at her with the open, unmanaged face that had been the first thing she had noticed about him. Nothing calculated, nothing arranged, simply a man receiving something true and being moved by it. "That is the most important thing anyone has ever said to me," he said. "I hope to keep saying important things," she said. "I am depending on it," he said, and smiled the quick, genuine smile, and she smiled back with her whole face, nothing arranged, and thought, yes, this is what the honest version feels like. They were married quietly in the spring of 1821, in the Surrey village church near her father's estate, where the hedgerows were beginning their spring green, and the air smelled of the countryside she had grown up in, and had always, underneath everything, carried with her. Her father walked her in with the solid, weathered calm of a man who has been waiting for this morning for 3 years and is not going to ruin it by being emotional, and then was entirely emotional, which made Rosalind laugh through her own tears in the front pew. Charlotte was there, radiant with the particular satisfaction of a woman whose patience has been abundantly rewarded. Lady Agatha attended, and said nothing, and pressed Rosalind's hand at the end of the ceremony, with the grip of someone communicating a whole history of understanding in a single touch. Margaret, her sister, wept openly and without management for the entirety of the service, and said afterward that it was the best wedding she had ever attended, which was an opinion she held despite having attended 17. They kept the Bloomsbury house, which was hers and which she had made entirely herself, and which she was not willing to leave, and James came into it not as a replacement of anything, but as an addition. His books beside her books, his thinking alongside her thinking, his presence in the house, something that did not diminish the space, but added to it in the way that genuine company does, the way that makes you wonder how you were filling the space before. He did not manage her. Not once, not in any of the years that followed, did she feel the calibration, the sense of being handled, of being given a version of something rather than the thing itself. They argued, regularly, about antiquities and politics, and the best management of the garden, and whether the sitting room needed new wallpaper, and the arguments were real, and occasionally loud, and always, eventually, productive, which was what arguments between people who respected each other were supposed to be. She kept her work at the charity school and eventually expanded it, with James's enthusiastic support and occasional practical assistance, into something larger, a proper institution for girls' education in the parish, which occupied a significant portion of her time and all of her organizational capability, and made her, in the quiet estimation of everyone who worked with her, one of the most effective and clear-eyed people they had encountered, which she received not with false modesty, but with the simple acknowledgement of someone who has been doing the work long enough to know when it is good. She thought, sometimes, about Edward. Not with anger. The anger had burned through long ago and left something cleaner behind it. Not with grief, because she had grieved the right things, and what she had been left with was not the loss of a marriage, but the gain of herself. She thought about him with a complicated, honest assessment that was something like, he had shown her, by being exactly what he was, exactly what she could not afford to live with, and had done her, in that terrible 4 seconds in a corridor, the involuntary and significant service of making a necessary thing unavoidable. She would not have chosen to learn it that way. But she had learned it, and the learning had made her the woman who stood in the Surrey churchyard on a spring morning and chose, with full knowledge and full clarity, something true. Once, in the 2nd year of their marriage, James asked her, not obtrusively, but with the direct and caring interest he brought to everything about her, whether she ever regretted the Bloomsbury years, whether the cost had been too high. She thought about this honestly, as she thought about everything. "No," she said, "not the cost, only the circumstances that made it necessary." She paused. "I regret that it had to hurt so much. I do not regret what I became because of it." He held her hand, in the way he had, the simple, present gesture of a man who is not performing support but providing it, and she looked out the window at the Bloomsbury garden, green in the spring, and thought about what Lady Agatha had said on that first visit, about learning who you are outside the structure of it, and how that was always harder than it sounds. She thought, it was harder than it sounds. She thought, I would not undo it. She thought, I am, finally and completely, the woman I was supposed to become, and I am known, and I am loved exactly as I am, and that, after everything, is not a small thing. It was, in fact, everything. And so ends tonight's tale. She caught her husband with another woman at the grand ball. A story not about a betrayal, though it began with one. A story about what a woman builds when the false version of her life is stripped away, and she is left with only the truth of herself and the question of what to do with it. A story about the difference between a man who manages you and a man who actually sees you. About the particular courage of a woman who looked at the worst thing clearly, without flinching, and then turned around and built something true in its place. A story about patience. About the Bloomsbury years, and the charity school, and the garden in spring, and Lady Agatha's 3 years that turned out to be less than 3. About learning to be your own, completely, before you offer yourself to anyone else. And now, our question for you tonight. If you were Rosalind, if you had seen what she saw in that corridor, if you had sat at that breakfast table and heard 8 months, what would you have done? Would you have had the courage to leave, even knowing the cost? Would you have taken the Bloomsbury house, and the smaller circle, and the slower, harder, truer life? Or is there something you would have done differently? Tell me what you would do if it were you in that story. We read every single comment and love hearing from you more than you know. If tonight's tale moved you, please give this video a like and subscribe to Tales of Whispering Hearts so you never miss a new story. Share this with someone who needs to be reminded that betrayal is not the end of the story. It is sometimes, painfully and against all appearances, the beginning of the truest one. Until next time, may you always know the difference between someone who manages you and someone who sees you, and may you always, always choose the one who sees. This has been Tales of Whispering Hearts.